So welcome everyone, and thank you very much for coming for this third paper in the series Tyranny and Democracy. So we've had an excellent, we've had some good papers already by Edward Harris in particular, and they're already recorded, and this session will be recorded as well. But it's great to have you all here joining us live. So I'd like to introduce our speaker this morning from New Zealand, from Victoria University in Wellington, which is James Kierstead. Now he is an expert on, particularly on ancient Greek history and on marrying various aspects of political science and social science with ancient history, and he was a pupil of Josiah Ober, who of course will be the last speaker in our series. So we welcome today his very distinguished student, and James will also, I should give a little bit of a plug, because he will be soon coming to my part of the world, to Cambridge, to give a paper for a conference at Cambridge on Antigone, the journal a number of you may have come across, which is a great resource, open access resource for studying classics, and he's also been very much involved with Heterodox Classics, the group which is affiliated with the Heterodox Academy. So move on there. But today he's going to speak about particularly an area which I know he's very interested in, which is freedom of speech, which is e-Sagoria. So I think I should shut up and let James take it away. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Edmund. And I'd like to start by thanking Edmund not only for that introduction, but also for inviting me to give this lecture, and Mateusz as well, and also the Institute of Advanced Studies at the Adam Mickiewicz University. I hope I've not pronounced that too badly. And I think the Institute for Classical Philology may have played some role too, so I'll thank them too. Can everybody hear me fine? Edmund's gone a bit.
Yes.
Edmund has stalled in my picture, so I was a bit worried. Okay, I'll just try and get my slides up. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides now.
Yes.
And I will proceed. Okay. It was the summer of 506 BC, and Athens' nascent democracy was in dire straits. The democracy had been founded only the previous year, after a popular uprising had succeeded in expelling a force of Spartans, led by their king Cleomenes, from the city. Cleomenes and his men had been acting in support of the Athenian aristocrat Isagoras, and their expulsion by the people of Athens paved their way for the return of Cleisthenes, Isagoras' rival, to the city. Cleisthenes, though he also came from an aristocratic family, had, so Herodotus tells us, joined forces with the people, that is, the demos, and after his return to Athens, he was given a free hand in the design of a new constitution for the city, a constitution that would later be referred to with the term demokratia, the power of the people. Now, though, it seemed like Cleisthenes' intricate new system, based on a complex and interlocking set of participatory institutions, would be crushed in the bud. Cleomenes, stinging from his humiliating exit from Athens, gathered an army from all over the Peloponnese, Sparta's sphere of influence, and marched to the sacred town of Eleusis, on the southwestern boundary of Attica, Athens' sovereign territory. As if the Spartan threat was not enough on its own, two of Athens' traditional enemies also invaded, no doubt hoping to take advantage of the city's newfangled and, it was probably assumed, unworkable new governmental system. The Boeotians, from the rich plainlands to Athens' northwest, captured a couple of towns on the Athenian side of the border, and the Chalcidians, from the island of Euboea, crossed over to Attica from the northeast and began ravaging crops. To any impartial observer, the most likely outcome of these events must have seemed that this triple alliance would overrun Athens, quickly putting an end to its new system of popular rule. And though a few other Greek city-states had developed popular constitutions before, probably, that might have been it for Athenian democracy. But miraculously, as it must have seemed, this isn't what happened. Instead, first the invading army at Eleusis dissolved after the Corinthians decided to abandon the campaign, and half the Spartan force followed. That still left Athens with two formidable enemies to fight. So what happened next must have seemed even more amazing to contemporary onlookers. Rather than being quickly and quietly dismantled, the new democratic state fought back, and devastatingly. Marching against the Boeotians first, the Athenians killed a great many of them, Herodotus reports, taking 700 prisoner. Then they wheeled to face the Chalcidians, destroying their force too. Just trying to change the slide. Cleisthenes' young democracy was now safe. But was it the new system itself that had injected the Athenians with a new vigor, helping them perform above all expectations on the field of battle? Herodotus certainly suspected as much. For the historian, Athens going from strength to strength on the battlefield in this way proved, if proof were needed, how fine a thing equality of speech, isagoria, is, not in one respect only, but in all. For when the Athenians were oppressed under tyrants, they had no better success in war than any of their neighbors. Yet, once the yoke was flung off, they proved the finest fighters in the world. This clearly shows, Herodotus continues, that so long as they were held down by authority, they deliberately shirked their duty in the field, as slaves shirk working for their masters. But when freedom was won, then every man among them was interested in his own cause. You can already see, I think, why I've led you to this passage in particular at the beginning of my contribution to this lecture series on tyranny and democracy. For Herodotus, the reason that the Athenians won that spectacular double victory over the Boeotians and Chalcidians was clearly that they were now free rather than oppressed under tyrants. And the Greek tyrannuomenoi here is an even more direct term. It means literally tyrannized over. This altered the incentives that went into their decision about whether to fight for their city and how hard to fight for it. When the Athenians were living under the tyrants that had preceded Cleisthenes, that is Pisistratus and his son Hippias, the Athenians saw little reason to risk life and limb on behalf of the city and put in as little actual fighting as they could. But once they were fighting for themselves, their own freedom and their own future, they had every reason to risk their necks, and so they did. While it might seem obvious why I've chosen to begin with this passage, and it is, I hope, reasonably clear what Herodotus is trying to say about tyranny and democracy in it, one thing is much less clear, and in fact has long been a source of puzzlement to the commentators. This is the word isagoria. Herodotus actually used the variant form isagoria, but it's the same word. Not that there's any mystery about the word itself or what it means. Isagoria is formed from the adjective isos, meaning equal. Think of, for example, an isosceles triangle, which has three equal sides. And from agora, a word that could refer to a public space of any kind, including a political assembly, as well as to the kind of public speech that might be expected there. As the word's etymology might lead us to expect, and as the many instances of it in Greek literature confirm, isagoria meant something like equality of public speech, an equal chance of speaking in public, or to render it more informally, a fair say. In many contexts, it covers much of the same semantic range as our own notion of free speech, though the emphasis in the Greek term is, as we've just seen, on equality rather than on freedom. And there's a recent paper by Alex Gottesman that places a slightly different emphasis on the term, which we'll come back to at the end of this lecture, but that's a good enough understanding of isagoria for now. So there is, as I say, no mystery about the word itself. What's more puzzling is why Herodotus uses it here. Why does Herodotus tell us that isagoria, in particular, led to the transformation of Athens' military capacities and fortunes, rather than, say, demokratia, a word that Herodotus did know, and which he even used of Cleisthenes' constitution. It's especially puzzling because, as we've just seen, Herodotus does offer us a theory of how he thinks the transition from tyranny to democracy boosted Athenian military performance. The only problem is that the theory has nothing to do with free or equal speech, focusing, as we've just seen, on the changed incentives that men face when they've been liberated from tyranny. So why doesn't Herodotus tell us that this shows how fine a thing eleutheria is, that is freedom, or even perhaps isonomia, equality under the law, another word that the Greeks used to refer to democratic or open constitutions. Now, most commentators and translators have been happy to see the use of isagoria here as a kind of metonymy, with the term simply standing in for those other concepts that we have mentioned, demokratia, eleutheria, isonomia, and with which it was closely associated. In the end, that may well be the most likely explanation, especially in view of the fact that equality of speech plays no role in Herodotus' theories about how Athens' democratic revolution helped them fight off the forces that encircled them in 506 BC. All the same, it may be that Herodotus had another theory about an association between free speech and state performance at the back of his mind. It's a theory that I think we can see evidence for in another episode related by the historian. And it's a theory that may have a lot to tell us about democracy, tyranny, and free speech and open discussion. In 480 BC, the Athenians once again found themselves with their backs to the wall. This time, their situation was, if anything, even more dire, since the enemy who was advancing towards them this time wasn't an alliance of Greek city-states, but the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the largest state the world had ever seen at this point. Herodotus is once again our best source for the episode, and he tells us that the Athenians, like good pious Greeks, decided to consult the Oracle of Delphi about what they should do. Now, the god Apollo, as you may be aware, wasn't known for giving clear and unambiguous advice, and this occasion was no exception. But the key part of Apollo's response was as follows: "The wooden wall alone shall not fall." This advice must have struck the Athenians as rather surprising, since if the city had a wall at all at this point, it would have been made of stone rather than wood. So what was this wooden wall that was supposedly the only thing that the Athenians could rely on? Herodotus describes for us the debate that ensued in the assembly. Some of the older citizens suggested that the wooden wall must be the thorn bushes that encircled the Acropolis, and that the god was advising them to take refuge on that holy citadel and await the Persians there. An alternative suggestion that the wooden wall referred to wooden battleships was rejected by the specialist oracular interpreters, the Kresmologoi. But at this point, the general Themistocles intervened, openly rejecting the specialist interpretation and adding his own arguments to the idea that what the Athenians should trust in was their navy. Themistocles' intervention won the day, and the Athenians, along with their allies, as you may know, went on to win a decisive naval victory over the Persians at the Battle of Salamis. This sort of process, I would suggest, that may have been at the back of Herodotus' mind when he claimed that isagoria had helped the Athenians improve their military performance in 506, even if he then went on to put forward a completely different theory as to what had helped them win those particular battles. The idea is a simple one. The Athenians were able to come up with what turned out to be the right response to the Persian threat through an open debate in which every citizen was allowed to put forward his own view. Though the Athenians listened to what the elders and the specialist oracular interpreters had to say, they were also open to other viewpoints and obviously felt no compunction about deciding in the end against the course of action that the elders and the religious experts had recommended. The point isn't that the Athenians disrespected their elders or that they scorned religion. In fact, their culture placed great emphasis on honoring both one's parents and the gods. The point is simply that these potential sources of authority didn't hold any trump cards in the context of a debate about what the city should do. In the assembly, at least, there was isagoria, equality of public speech. This theory that allowing open debate can improve the quality of decision-making is one that seems to have caught on in Athens, and it can be found in 4th century texts as well. We find it hinted at in Aristotle's well-known summation argument from Politics, Book 3, where the philosopher suggests that A multitude in which each individual is not a good man may yet be better together than a few good men, not individually, but collectively, just as public feasts to which many contribute are better than those supplied by one man alone. And Aristotle's exact contemporary, Demosthenes, expresses the idea more explicitly at the beginning of the first work in his corpus of speeches, the first Olympiac oration. You would, I expect, men of Athens, the orator says, accept it as the equivalent of a large amount of money, if it could be made clear to you what will prove our best policy in the matters under discussion. This then being so, you're bound to give an eager hearing to all who offer advice. For not only if someone comes forward with a well-considered plan, could you hear and accept it, but also I count it part of your good fortune that more than one speaker may be inspired with suitable suggestions on the spur of the moment, so that out of the multitude of proposals, the choice of the best should not be difficult. Now, there are, of course, some important differences between these various passages. At the same time, they do all clearly express a central idea, that open debate among people who are treated as equals can increase the likelihood of a good outcome in various kinds of joint endeavors. In the passage from Demosthenes, the emphasis is again very much on foreign policy and on war. Here again, equality of speech is being recommended on the basis that it can improve military performance in particular. Now, is this true? Is the idea that free speech makes states more competitive on the battlefield one that actually makes a rigorous kind of sense and that stands up to historical and empirical scrutiny? Well, as often with big questions in history, it's complicated. We've heard Herodotus' story about how an open debate on the interpretation of an oracle led to the Athenians choosing the right strategy in the Persian Wars, and we've heard Herodotus affirm Isagoria as the decisive factor in the Athenians' successful defense of their new democratic constitution, even if the historian's explanation on that occasion had nothing in the end to do with equal speech. But what about Demosthenes? How did the Athenians get on after being exposed to his wonderful advice, as well as the advice of many other speakers in the assembly? Not very well, as it turned out. Olynthus, the city which Demosthenes had urged Athens to defend in his Olympiac orations, was razed to the ground by the Macedonians in 348 BC. And the Athenians lost first their traditional spheres of influence and then their independence to the same enemy. When Athens tried to rebel against the Macedonians after Alexander the Great's death in 323, it was already too late. Demosthenes fled to the island of Calauria the following year, where he committed suicide by drinking hemlock. Of course, as many of you are probably thinking, the fact that democratic Athens was eventually overwhelmed by Macedon doesn't show in itself that the kind of Isagoria the Athenians had in their assembly wasn't helpful. It could be that Macedon's superior resources would have seen it win out in the end anyway, and that victory would only have been quicker and more complete without the ability of speakers like Demosthenes to have their say. Equally, that the Athenians defeated their enemies in 506 and again at Salamis surely wasn't entirely due to the debates that took place in the assembly, even if they may have played some role. To tease out which factors are contributing to which outcomes, and ideally to what extent, quantitative social scientists try to find correlations within large numbers of cases. They also try to control for various factors, that is, to make sure that it's the factor they're interested in and not some others that are contributing to any correlation that they observe. Not surprisingly, social scientists have been addressing the question of whether democracies are better at war-making than rival systems for the past several decades, in large part by making use of these simple methods, though obviously in a more sophisticated way than I can describe here. What do they find? The question, as I've said, is a very complicated one, and it continues to be debated at the empirical and other levels of analysis. But many studies have suggested that democracies are, in fact, more militarily successful than non-democracies. In their influential 2002 book, Democracies at War, for example, Dan Reiter and Alan Stam found that democracies win about 3/4 of the wars they're involved in, and they win nearly all of the wars that they themselves initiate. A number of other scholars, such as David Lake, have also published findings that seem to point to a military dividend from democracy. These results apply to democracy, though, not to freedom or equality of speech, and we should probably not repeat Herodotus' slip and unconsciously replace one term with the other. In the years since Reiter and Stam's work, much of the scientific action has seemed to focus on figuring out what precisely explains the excellent military records that democracies have produced. Some have suggested that it isn't really democracy that's doing the work here, but rather attributes associated with democracy, such as wealth or good military-civil relations. Among those that do think democracy plays a causal role, there are some who see open discussions as helping produce good political decisions, for example, about whether to go to war in the first place, good military decisions, and better military technology. But there are also those who see democracy's advantage as relying on other factors entirely, from differing levels of human capital and education to differences in national culture, not excluding religion. Reiter and Stamm's two central explanations for the pattern they observed were, as it happens, first, the greater openness of democratic nations, which helps them make sure to pick fights they can win, and second, the greater dedication to their cause shown by soldiers fighting for free societies. It won't have escaped your notice, I hope, that these two main explanations offered up by two very fine modern social scientists after years of number crunching are more or less the same as those we've already seen in the works of the 5th century BC historian Herodotus. That's not to suggest that Reiter and Stamm's work is somehow trivial. Trying to rigorously test an idea that has been around for quite literally ages is a very valuable thing. But it does raise a further question, one which, I have a sense, is among the central concerns of this lecture series. If we have some good reasons to think that free speech is part of the explanation for the military success of democracies in the modern world, to what extent is that also true of the ancient world? The question is an especially important one, because political scientists tend to focus on periods for which they have good data, and this means that the full suite of statistical techniques can usually only be applied to the most recent periods of history. Reiter and Stamm's set of military victories by regime type, for example, only goes back to 1800. Again, I'm not trying to malign social scientists. The kinds of statistical inquiries they conduct with modern nation states is extremely worthwhile. But it does leave the vast expanses of human history untouched and often unintegrated into their models. Can ancient historians help? I think we might be able to, even if we can rarely hope to come up with the kind of data that social scientists like to work with. Some work has already been done on the relationship between democracy and state capacity in ancient Greece by another speaker in the series. Edmund's already mentioned, that is Josiah Ober. Drawing mainly on the information compiled in Mearns Hansen and Thomas Nielsen's Inventory of Archaic and Classical Polis, Ober finds that though the best performing city-states tend to be moderate oligarchies, democracies perform very well in the brutally competitive environment of the ancient Mediterranean. When it comes to Athens in particular, Ober finds that the periods in which the city was most powerful and prosperous by a number of measures also tended to be periods in which its democracy was in its rudest health. As Ober himself would freely admit, these observations lack the statistical robustness of the studies of modern regimes that we've just been referring to. We should also step back once again from making the same slip that Herodotus made in conflating democracy with free and equal speech. Ober's examination of Athenian state performance focuses on democratia as a whole, not isagoria, and I don't know of any studies that look for associations between the environment for free speech in ancient Greek city-states and their military success. That's not entirely surprising. Not only do we not have scores for free speech rights in Greek polis of the type that are routinely given to modern nation-states by institutes like Pew Research or Freedom House, but the state of the evidence for city-states outside of Athens would make awarding scores of this sort very difficult. One could, I suppose, use democracy as a kind of proxy for free speech, but that would only get us back to the problem we started with of how to separate isagoria from democratia. Instead of trying to pursue this route any further then, let's try a different tack. As well as seeking out correlations among observed phenomena, social scientists also hunt for mechanisms which might actually link two variables together in a plausible way. We've already been doing a little bit of this ourselves. We saw above that democracy and military success do seem to be associated. We then started considering some possible mechanisms that might support a claim of causation. That is, that democracy played a role in bringing into being or maintaining national security, a high level of national security. Two mechanisms that Reiter and Stamm thought might link democracy and security were the greater incentives on free men to fight for their countries and the greater openness of democratic societies. That Herodotus suggested both these explanations only goes to remind us that this search for causal mechanisms isn't something that's confined to trained political scientists. We often do it ourselves without much prompting, almost as a matter of course, albeit in an informal way. The highest quality scientific studies find ways of testing for the operation of various mechanisms that have been suggested. Due to all the difficulties facing researchers of the ancient world, though, this isn't what I'm proposing to do here. Instead, I propose to look at just one possible mechanism linking free speech and democracy, as well as tyranny, and see if we can find evidence that it was in operation, or at least perceived to be in operation, in ancient Greece. Now, in my abstract, I've called this the tyrant's dilemma, though I'm not sure this is the usual way that the term is used. In any case, in my version of the tyrant's dilemma, authoritarian rulers have a choice every time someone in their own camp speaks up against them or even offers a criticism. They can choose to punish the dissident, or they can choose to let their comments pass, even perhaps taking them on board. Imagine a dictator who's told by an underling, a regional governor, perhaps, that the latest 5-year plan is not, in fact, going to plan. So badly is it going, in fact, that the people are getting restless. They hate the dictator. The dictator, says the governor, needs to change course fast for the good of the whole country. What should the dictator do when he hears this critique? In most dictatorships, there is a tendency to want to punish dissidents, even high-ranking ones like a governor. This isn't simply because hearing negative feedback can be uncomfortable, although this surely plays some role. It's also because dictatorships, if they want to remain dictatorships, and many do, need to make sure that dissidents don't become too powerful, or at least nowhere near powerful enough to overthrow the regime. So the obvious choice for any true dictator would seem to be to punish the dissident and the internal critic of the regime. Where then does the dilemma arise? The dilemma arises from the fact that if the dictator punishes the bearers of bad news too harshly, he will receive less and less accurate information about the real state of things in his country and beyond. And not having an accurate picture of the real state of things can have real drawbacks when it comes to practical concerns, such as managing nations and competing with foreign powers. Now that we're familiar with the basic idea behind what I'm calling the tyrant's dilemma, let me point out that it does leave some room for different situations and for differences between individual autocrats. As far as individual situations are concerned, we might predict, for example, that more public criticisms by figures whose hostility to the regime is well established will be treated more harshly on the whole than private advice from long-standing loyalists. As for differences between autocrats, the historical record, not to mention personal experience, seems to make clear that all bosses are not alike. Some seem relatively content to take criticism on board, as long as there is no threat to the established order. Others fly off the handle at any perceived slight, wreaking further havoc on their already cowed followers and already oppressed populations. Now, the ancient Greeks were clearly different to us in many ways, and we will come to some of those differences later on in the lecture. But we should, I think, be wary of schools of thought that cast peoples from a different time as somehow incomprehensibly other. After all, the Greeks were humans like us, and like us, they carried the inherited capacities and dispositions that had been created over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. It's safe to assume, I think, at least as a working hypothesis, that ancient Greek rulers could well have felt the force of the kinds of incentives I've outlined above, and thus found themselves on the horns of the dilemma I have described. Of course, we can go beyond simply assuming this as a working hypothesis by looking at the written evidence that remains to us from ancient Greece. And though we don't have the kind of documentary evidence that we can often turn to in the study of modern tyrants, the literary record makes clear, I think, that the Greeks did recognize a version of my tyrant's dilemma. They also, it would seem, had a sense that flying off the handle at negative feedback was something that was a characteristic of particularly autocratic rulers, and that the more likely a ruler was to shoot the messenger, the more they could be described as a bad sort of autocrat, even as a tyrant, a term which, as Edmund has argued, may always have involved a strongly negative value judgment. Now, the clearest portrayal of this, I think, comes in Sophocles' play Antigone. It's abundantly clear, of course, that Creon, the ruler of Thebes in the play, is no democratic president. He is called King Basileus once. He's called Lord Anax no fewer than 9 times. He's called Chief Tagos on another occasion. And most importantly for our purposes here, he's called Tyrant Tyrannos twice. In the play's first episode, a guard enters, clearly nervous about having to address Creon. Though Creon's first response is to ask him why he's so afraid, the guard's fears are actually vindicated as the scene plays out, with the tyrant threatening to have him strung up. This never actually takes place, but I am not sure that the recent move among interpreters and performers of the play, myself included in a recent production, the recent trend to treat the guard as essentially a comic figure, I'm not sure this is quite right. The totality of our evidence from the classical period suggests that the Athenians and the Greeks treated tyranny very seriously. And no wonder, since a tyrannical ruler deaf to any advice could get things very wrong indeed. Granted, in real life, that process rarely had the clarity that it does in Antigone. The other episodes of that play trace out what Charles Siegel called a crescendo of arrogance, as Creon angrily rejects the advice of others, including his son Haemon and the soothsayer Tiresias. Still, there might be something useful that some other than you might think, Haemon urges. It's also good to learn from those who advise well, he reiterates before asking his father in exasperation, do you just want to go on speaking and by speaking never do any listening? Creon's answer to that is, it would seem, yes, until it's too late, by which time his refusal to consider advice has led to bloody catastrophe for himself and for his family. Why does Creon take such a strong stand? It seems to be, as my tyrant's dilemma model would predict, because he wants to preserve his power, and he sees any dissent as a threat. Creon issues several blunt assertions of his authority, perhaps the bluntest of which comes in his opening speech when he proclaims, I hold all the powers and the throne. But even more revealing is, once again, what his son Haemon tells him. Your face is terrible to a simple citizen. It frightens him from words you dislike to hear. He goes on to tell his father that many people in Thebes are sympathetic to Antigone, and that they think the death sentence Creon has laid down is excessive. Haemon calls this the dark rumor that spreads in secret. It would be hard to find a more perfect encapsulation of the tendency of tyrants to deny themselves useful information by sanctioning critics of their rule. But this, of course, is poetry, or more precisely, verse drama, and it's drama from a genre, Attic tragedy, that had an inclination to place its plots in distant mythological realms rather than in the world of the present. My point here is mainly that the Greeks perceive the operation of the mechanism I'm talking about, my tyrant's dilemma. Not that we necessarily have plentiful documentary evidence of it in historical times. But let's now turn to the flip side of the tyrant's dilemma. What's the flip side of the tyrant's dilemma? Well, it's the absence or relative absence of a similar dilemma in regimes that aren't set up to keep one individual or a small set of individuals in power. If tyrants have to decide whether to allow an inflow of useful critical feedback that might risk turning into a flood of insurrection, democracies should be able to cope with higher levels of criticism and complaint. The idea that democracies allow for more esegeria than tyrants do is also, as it happens, found in tragedy. One example is a well-known passage from Euripides' Suppliant Women, a passage that is among our few substantive fragments of ancient Greek democratic theory. When the herald enters, he asks, who is the tyrant, the tyrannos of this land, that is Athens? The answer comes back that he's gone wrong already in seeking a tyrant, tyrannos here. Now that answer comes somewhat strangely from Theseus, the mythical king of Athens, who equally strangely goes on to offer a kind of paean to Demokratia. Theseus's praise of democracy mixes together various characteristics of popular rule, the rule of law, freedom, and so on. But there in the mix is the right of the free man to give counsel to the city-state. And he who chooses to do so gains renown, while he who does not wish to stays silent, Theseus says, concluding with the rhetorical query, what greater equality can there be in a city? I could add more references to passages from drama in which democracy and free speech go together, although the Greek word used in many of these cases is actually parrhesia, another word for free speech rather than esegeria. But we can see reasonably clearly, I think, that the association between democracy on the one hand and free and equal speech on the other is more than simply a dramatic trope. We can see this clearly because the evidence for the operation of democracy, especially in Athens, is quite plentiful. And what it shows us is a political culture that sought, as a rule, to encourage and embody the value of esegeria. At the beginning of each meeting of the Athenian assembly, a herald asked, who wishes to speak? And the verb that he used for speak in that context, agoruein, was, I think, not entirely coincidentally, etymologically linked to the word esegeria. Citizen speeches also held sway in the council, the courts, and in the city's many boards of officials, and these speeches were regulated in a way that often betrayed an obsession with the principle of equality. Courtroom speeches were kept to the same length by water clocks, for example, And in the council, even the sitting position of the councillors was selected by lot to avoid giving anyone an undue advantage in the debate. Athens as a whole, of course, had a robust and remarkable culture of public writing and public speech, its public spaces famously full of inscriptions and alive with the hubbub of disputation and dialogue. I'm aware, of course, that the mention of dialogue may make some of you think of Socrates and about what happened to him. Evidently, Athens doesn't have an absolutely perfect record when it comes to freedom and equality of speech. At the same time as a lengthy and thorough recent survey of the evidence by Jacob Filonik of the University of Silesia has reiterated, episodes like Socrates' execution were more the exception than the rule. And though it's true that many of our sources make tolerably clear that a relatively small set of speakers dominated debates in the assembly, there's also evidence that the ordinary man did occasionally speak up, even if that was to the chagrin of some of the snootier attendees. Socrates himself, according to Plato's dialogue Protagoras, wondered aloud why, when it came to matters of public policy, the Athenians allowed anybody to stand up and speak in the assembly, any man, that is. After all, he could be a carpenter or a smith, as Socrates puts it, a shoemaker, a shopkeeper, or a ship owner. We should also note, finally, that the tendency of democracies to be associated with looser norms about expression could also have its downsides. Matt Simonton has argued, for instance, that oligarchies' need to keep a tighter lid on public disorder led to democratic city-states having higher levels of violence. It's also not unlikely, as has been suggested from Demosthenes' time onwards, that individual monarchs like Philip could gain some advantage in long-running wars by concealing their own strategy while keeping their ears pricked for news of their enemies' tactics, news which would often not be that hard to come by when it came to democratic city-states that debated affairs of state in public. Still, Simonton's theory about public order should bring us back to the central mechanism I've tried to describe here. Oligarchies and tyrannies both have a need to keep a particular set of people in power. Democracies don't, at least in theory. In theory, a democracy should have all the same incentives as tyrants to want to gather accurate information, but without the disincentives that come from a need to keep a lid on dissent and free thinking. Of course, no democracy is perfect, but what I've delineated here is a dynamic that should lead to a tendency towards greater openness. This greater openness to ideas should, in turn, help democracies come to better decisions, including in the foreign policy arena. If this is a factor, it won't in itself overpower other considerations, such as rival non-democratic states' greater resources, as perhaps was relevant in the case of Macedon, nor is it likely to explain success in war all on its own. But it may be one important factor, among others. Maybe this is enough about war. So here I want to change tack. Let's go back then to the tyrant's dilemma and take a slightly different route from there. In Xenophon's Hero, a strange imagined dialogue between a tyrant and a poet about whether tyrants are happier than other people, the poet, Simonides, argues that one of the advantages of holding power is that nobody insults you. Because nobody, as Simonides puts it, is keen to publicly criticize a tyrant to his face. And once again, we have the verb kategorein has that element of agora, agoruo in it, which links it to isagoria. Hero, the tyrant's response is a somewhat melancholy one. How much joy do you suppose there is in people not saying anything bad to you, when it's an open secret that everyone who's holding their tongue actually wishes the tyrant ill? Again, this passage seems to illustrate quite well what I've described as the tyrant's dilemma, or at least the futility of choosing the path of suppressing dissent. One interesting thing about this passage, though, is that Simonides and Hero seem to look at this phenomenon from the side not of the tyrant, but of his subjects. It's presented almost as a natural fact that people don't generally like to criticize tyrants, at least not openly, and especially not in their presence, but that they'll often make clear privately that they don't, in fact, like the tyrant at all. This kind of phenomenon, where people guard their true views about something, should be familiar from the modern world too. In a famous essay, the Czech dissident Václav Havel tells a story about a shopkeeper who puts up a poster with communist slogans on his shop window. Is this because he's a fervent supporter of the regime? Perhaps, but perhaps not. Perhaps he's only displaying the poster to keep out of trouble. The problem with this sort of so-called preference falsification, of course, is that if everybody does it, a situation may develop in which a regime is actually highly unpopular, but next to nobody is aware of that fact. This in turn stifles the possibility of any meaningful change. A would-be dissident looks down a street of shop windows, every one of which seems to have a pro-communist poster in it. Who would help him if he took some kind of a stand? As far as he can tell, nobody. In this lecture, I've focused mainly on the relationship between free and equal speech and military success, and I've really only concerned myself with delineating a single mechanism, my tyrant's dilemma, which seems to have been noticed in the ancient world as well as the modern, and which may play some role in explaining the apparent superiority of democracies in war. Obviously, though, life isn't all about war, or at least it shouldn't be, and these days, thankfully, military survival and success are less of a pressing concern in our politics than they once were. I chose Havel's example of a greengrocer feeling forced to put up pro-communist posters in his shop window, partly because it will, I hope, point us towards a more general theory of how isegaria might be a fine thing for any community that aims to flourish to its fullest capacities. Since the 1970s and 80s, a new way of conceptualizing and justifying democracy emerged among democratic theorists. This new model, which eventually became known as deliberative democracy, tended to see democracy as, to borrow Amartya Sen's phrase, government by discussion. Indeed, for many deliberative theorists, this was a great part of democracy's purpose, to create and support a certain kind of rational and evidence-based discussion, that is, deliberation, as a way of making communal decisions. The philosopher Jürgen Habermas, a seminal figure in the development of the theory of deliberative democracy, tried to describe what he called the ideal speech situation, one in which all participants had an equal right to speak and everyone could contribute to the discussion by supplying their own arguments and evidence. Habermas's ideal is a noble one, as is the deliberative ideal more generally. All the same, I know I'm not alone in wondering whether the deliberative democracy movement has sometimes defined rational discussion too narrowly, and whether elevating an ideal of deliberation as the raison d'etre of democracy risks sidelining other important democratic values. Joshua Cohen, one of the most brilliant democratic theorists of the last few decades, is fond of contrasting deliberative democracy, in which collective decision-making is molded by standards of reasonable discussion, with what he calls aggregative democracy, in which voters' raw preferences are simply added up to produce an outcome. I'm as fond as Cohen is of reasonable discussion, but I also think there may, after all, be something to be said for the idea of democracy as aggregation. Equality of speech was certainly one of the foundational concerns of the deliberative Democrats, so to claim that they never valued isegaria would be ludicrous. What I would argue, though, is that relaxing our focus on rationality as a set of conversational norms can open our eyes to a broader way in which democracy might be seen to embody a kind of rationality that autocratic regimes like Sophocles' Creon writ large have a habit of angrily rejecting. To get closer to what I mean by this, let's take another Cold War example. In the Soviet economy, as in most centrally planned economies, gaps between the level of supply of products and the level of demand for them were quite common. Commodities were often produced according to quotas and targets set by the central bureaucracy, often with absurd results. By the 1980s, the USSR was producing 3 pairs of shoes for every citizen, and yet was completely unable to supply a range of of other goods of the quantity and quality that Soviet citizens increasingly desired. The reason was because, however dedicated the central planners were to the ideal of communism, however able individual bureaucrats may have been, the system of so-called material balancing simply wasn't feasible. It was just too hard in the end for central planners to predict what types of goods would be in next year, or how deeply people were willing to dip into their pockets for them, or even, as it turned out, how many pairs of shoes would be needed. Why then were liberal capitalist states able to match the supply and demand of goods so much more effectively? The answer is that they largely didn't try. Instead, they mostly simply allowed individuals to produce, sell, and buy goods as they saw fit, with the relevant information about how many people wanted a particular commodity and how badly embedded in a single figure. This is, as you may know, is Friedrich von Hayek's account of price. The price you see on a good in a store or on a website may seem a humble thing, but for Hayek it succeeded in doing something that even the most talented central planners could not hope to do. It aggregated information about the desires and inclinations of millions of producers and consumers, information that was, at least in any precise form, virtually impossible to get in any other way. and it did so quickly and efficiently in response to the momentary fluctuations of supply and demand. Analogies between democracy and capitalism shouldn't be pushed too far, and there's certainly important differences between the two, not least that whereas citizens in a democracy are usually afforded an equal vote, the members of capitalist economies tend not to start out with the same number of dollars, and that's to put things mildly. All the same, Hayek's insight about the nature of price as a mechanism for aggregating information can, I think, be applied to the institutions of democracy. This applies, above all, to voting, which aggregates information about the preferences that citizens have for various candidates for office, or in a referendum about the different policies on offer. But it may also help us think about free speech. Greg Lukianoff has recently defended what he calls the pure informational theory of free speech. For Lukianoff, the value of trying to afford others an equal ability to speak their minds isn't dependent on the reasonableness or cogency of their contributions. Instead, what makes being able to hear others' ideas valuable is that even when we think they are wrong-headed or even absurd, knowing about these ideas and about who holds them helps us fill out a picture of the way things really are in our society, a picture that includes the true balance of opinion on a range of issues. Free speech in this formulation reveals and releases individually held information that might not otherwise have been available to society as a whole. Free expression aids in the construction of a rational political order, not because every utterance is or should be reasoned, but because it helps us make sure that our collective decisions are based on an accurate conception of the world. If this generalization of what I've called the tyrant's dilemma is along the right lines, then similar points can also be made for organizations and even societies that seek to curtail the free flow of information and ideas. To the extent that feedback that elites don't particularly like to hear are ignored or suppressed, an inaccurate picture of the world and of voters' preferences will be created. And arguably, we've seen this mechanism at work in the past few years, with polls for the Brexit referendum and the US presidential election in 2016, the UK general election in 2019, and the Australian general election the same year, all turning out to have been some distance short of the actual results, apparently in large part because voters are hesitant to admit certain widespread political beliefs, even to pollsters. Now, that kind of error may not seem disastrous, though it certainly won't have been helpful to anyone who was confidently relying on the expected results. And though we are still thankfully far from the kinds of delusions created by regimes such as communist Czechoslovakia or Russia, we would be naive to think that the suppression of open discussion won't produce other types of delusion, some of which may land us in a great deal of trouble. The record of history seems clear about that. And that might be a good place to end this Herodotean inquiry into Zagoria, tyranny and democracy. There was actually one further point I wanted to get in, but I think I've tested your patience enough. So with that, I'll try to practice some Zagoria and I'll invite questions.
Thank you so much, James. And I think there are lots of points to bring out. You covered a great deal of detail, so that was wonderful. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, but would anyone like to begin? I might start off. Oh no, Malcolm Lowe. Hello, sir. Would you like to take
yes,
your...
do you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to say that there seems to be an underlying assumption that Isagoria goes along together with democracy, but I think this is mistaken. I think that if you take, for example, the example of the Roman Republic, which by all evaluations was an oligarchy rather than a democracy, there was also a very considerable element of Isagoria, for example, in the Senate, where you had 300 or 600 or even 900 members. Everybody could speak, and probably as many people spoke in the Senate debate as spoke in the debates of the Demos in Athens. So it's possible, just as Rome is an example, it shows that equality of speech can play an important role in oligarchy as well as in democracy. I think also in classical Sparta, there were opportunities for many people to speak, even though Sparta also was generally regarded as an oligarchy.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think you're right. I mean, I think it's a question of, it's a sort of a sliding scale. I think that in democracies, we have more of an emphasis on exegeria, but we also have more of an emphasis on even more unrestricted forms of free speech, like parrhesia, which I couldn't get into in the lecture. I mean, the kind of ribald free speech you find in Aristophanes, if you compare it with Menander, okay, there might be some cultural changes that it partly explain that, but it would seem like there's also the beginnings of a move away from democracy by Menander's time, and there does seem to be a correlation, or there does seem to be some correlation between that kind of ribald free speech and more thoroughgoing democratia. But I'm partly glad that you asked that question, because one of the things that I didn't have time to get into was this recent paper by Alex Gottesman, in which he talks about exegeria. And he goes back through the sources, and he comes up with a slightly tweaked definition of exegeria, not so much as equality of speech, but as the speech of equals. So he thinks that exegeria, if you look in the sources, it's fundamentally about, it's the kind of speech that you have when you're among peers. And so that obviously can help us with various moments in political history, and also the history of political philosophy. Because as you say, there have been moderate republican, or what we might call oligarchic regimes, from the Roman Republic to Sparta to Venice, where this idea that there should be speech among peers has been paramount. And we might also talk about the English Commonwealth. So Teresa Bejan has talked about this too, the development of these democratic norms in the modern world. It often seems to be associated first and foremost with extending these rights as sort of privileges among a certain set of people. And then for various reasons that the historical sociologists can tell us more about, they're extended. So I think all that's still consistent with the way I answered your question at the beginning, which is that I think that, yes, you can find exegeria in an oligarchy and in a republic, but these rights are in a way more thoroughgoing, they're more expansive, and they're more emphasized in democratic regimes than they are in oligarchic ones.
Well, I would say that in Rome, there was the ability of multiple speakers to give different kinds of advice was effectively equal to that in Athens. I mean, if you have a Senate of 600 people, it gives a large scope. And also in the history of Rome, at least as is depicted by the Roman historians themselves, the ability of different people to give different advice played an important role constantly in the development of the Roman Republic into an empire covering the whole Mediterranean.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I would say with the point about the Senate, I mean, you have to think about what was the Senate like in terms of political sociology? How many people were in the Senate compared to the population as a whole? And if you compare that situation with the Athenian citizenry, it gets a little bit complicated because there are all these different sorts of people.
I would compare the number of people who spoke at meetings of the Demos with the number of people who spoke at meetings of the Senate. I think you would probably find that they were similar.
I'm not sure how many people have done that, but I mean, are you talking about the total number of people as well? Because well, I mean, it is true. So you know, the assembly. How many people turned up to the Athenian assembly? Well, it seems like sort of 5,000, more than 5,000 in the 5th century, and probably around 6,000 on most occasions in the 4th century. So then, how many citizens are there in Athens in the 5th century? Probably 60,000, 30,000 in the 4th century. So the point is just that that's actually the number of people in the assembly is actually a reasonably high percentage compared to other systems. And even if everybody doesn't, you know, there's not an absolutely equal distribution of speaking, I do think that system compares fairly well in terms of the opportunities that citizens have to speak to most oligarchies. One of the things that seemed to distinguish Greek oligarchies, of course, was that they had property requirements for citizenship. So they still have assemblies, and you can go participate in the assemblies, but only in Sparta, for example, if you are able to pay your mess hall bills, right? If you're a member of a syssition. So I think you can already see there that the number of people who are able to speak in these fora is lesser in oligarchies.
Well, no, I'm not talking about the people who are able to speak, but the number of people who actually did speak. Because if you read, for example, Thucydides' descriptions of the deliberations in the demos, and you read the descriptions by Livy or Sallust of the discussions in the Senate, in both cases, you find that it's a relatively small number of people who actually do speak. And so the question is the number of people who actually did speak, as opposed to those who had the right to speak.
Sorry, this is a fascinating discussion, but I wonder if we could, and perhaps we can return to it in a moment, but I noticed that Xavier Marquez wanted to come in, so if I may invite you to speak, to ask a question.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
I hear you, yeah.
Thanks, James, for that. Just wanting to go back to kind of an interesting tension you point between Isagoria and Parousia that you mentioned at the end, sort of the quality of speech versus a sort of fearless speech. And that comes up in various ways in your lecture, I think, and the sort of the tension between the speech of the dissident, fearless, against the tyrant, say, Havel. Truth.
Yeah, no, I
versus a sort of institutionalized speech of democracy where everybody has the same opportunity. I think those actually are quite different in many ways, and the sort of you might think of them as both being ingredients of speech in democratic Athens, but also if you think about what happens in sort of the modern public sphere, it's not for lack of speech. You don't see a lack of speech in, say, China, for instance, or in other modern forms of non-democratic governments. Certain forms of control over what you call sort of the flow of information, right? There are different ways in which speech works. There's a really nice book by Margaret Roberts on censorship in China, and she talks about what's it called? Plotting versus censorship versus sort of the ways that the strategies that non-democratic states use to sort of regulate the public sphere. Not all of them have to do with reducing speech, but some of them actually have to do with increasing speech, increasing certain kinds of speech, sort of flooding the public sphere, making it making more worthless information more easily findable, rather than the sort of worthwhile speech that is sort of central to discussions of democratic speech in the classical period, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Javier. I actually I missed a little bit of that, which is ironic because you're the only other person from Wellington.
In New Zealand, yes.
Sorry.
Did my thing cut off?
No, I think I understood what you were saying generally. So the last thing was about, is there actually a reduction of speech in these authoritarian regimes? And it's a little bit of I would say it's a little bit of a philosophical distinction. I mean, in some sense, I guess what I'm really concerned with is the idea of free speech and equal speech. So even though an autocratic regime might not want to sort of make people talk less in terms of the sort of number of words that are put out, I think it does make sense to talk about a freedom of speech if the regime start being like the Ford Company and saying you can have any color car as long as it's black. You can have any kind of speech you want as long as it doesn't say this, as long as it doesn't mention Tibet or whatever. So
one of the interesting things about something like the sort of the Russian or the Chinese public sphere is that a lot of it is about making some speech be less important, because it's lost in the flood of trivial or other information. it reduces its sort of epistemic importance, I guess, even if there are people actually speaking truth, right? Like it's not like you can't find dissidents in China or Russia or so on, even though they might be marginalized in some ways. Right?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, do you think that this is a relatively novel technique that's come in with the rise of social media and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, it seems to be. I'm not sure how new it is ultimately, but it does seem to be to have something to do with the rise of the sort of the modern public sphere, the modern social media, digital media, and so on. The different ways in which. But I'm not sure. I mean, certainly people like John Keane think there's something new about this, basically.
Right. I just mentioned briefly in reaction to the first point that you brought up about parousia and zygoria. Yeah, I've written elsewhere about parousia, and I didn't really get time to go into it here. But conventionally they're usually contrasted. Parousia is this wild, crazy free speech. It has to do more with comedy and public festival, and it's quite sort of ribald and open-ended. And zygoria is associated more with institutions. Now, this paper by Alex Gottesman looks again at the evidence and suggests that this association with institutions and zygoria is solid enough, but there's less evidence than you might think for that. And instead, it's more about this interpersonal relationship, that zygoria is the kind of speech that you can make when a peer is in the room. And in particular interest to this lecture series, zygoria is the kind of speech you cannot exercise when there's a tyrant in the room, or when you're in a royal court, for example. And there's also, so in that way, it actually seems to draw zygoria a bit closer to parousia, because in some of the tragic instances of the word parousia, that's also often stressed, that parousia is about the ability of people who are lower down the pecking order to speak truth or speak their opinion to those who are higher up. And there's also some fascinating instances in Plato and Aristotle where figures like Callicles, who have very kind of anti-democratic or views that go against the mainstream, they're encouraged to exercise parousia with the idea in mind that the demos has the ruling ideology. So the parousia there is actually exercising your right to voice an opinion that goes against the current ruling ideology.
Any further questions? Yes, I found that Gottesman article very helpful myself, and I thought it's interesting, Xavier, the point you make about tyrannies and oligarchies that having lots of discussion, but it is interesting how certainly when you hear accounts of how Mao's China, the workings of the Politburo, there's lots of speech, but it's a very sort of false speech, which there are only certain things that can be said, but people say them an awful lot. Like when the Great Leap Forward, they were constantly saying how wonderful everything is going, but there are some problems, but it's sometimes you need to cut off a finger to keep the whole hand healthy or something like that. And you can never directly criticize the leader. There's often people who you can criticize, like, for example, the leader's wife it is a big one. So it's a very different type of, it seems like a very different type of discussion, and that seems to be echoed very much in our ancient sources. And there's a wonderful passage with Herodotus. Actually, the Persians are regularly having discussions, and mostly the Persians just tell Xerxes what he wants to hear, and then occasionally you get someone like Artemisia, the tyrant of Halicarnassus, speak truth, but she does it not just because she wants to speak truth, but because there are always flatterers in a tyrannical circle, and there are occasional truth tellers, and you get some credit for being the occasional truth teller. Although you shouldn't be doing it too often, but sometimes, the tyrant responds and says, you're the only person who tells me the truth. I really value you. So your point about the tyrant's dilemma is, I think, spot on and really, really good. I don't want to hog the floor too much. I just had one quick question which I wanted to get in, which is I wonder whether when we compare democracy and tyranny, or democracy in the way that you did, James, we often think of, it's just democracy or it's just tyranny. But one of the things I'm starting to wonder is whether we shouldn't be comparing democracies at different times in their lives, the lives of a democracy, and simply tyrannies or non-democracies at different times in the life of that regime. Because I wonder whether, certainly when you compare Athens, I think the Athenians, you're right, at the start of the democracy seemed very willing to fight, and are very belligerent and very active throughout the 5th century. But certainly by the 4th century, there's a much more unwillingness to commit militarily. And to a certain extent, that has a lot to do with a lot of Athenian power by the second half of the 4th century. But I do also wonder, certainly one can see the same sort of development in modern societies towards democracy becoming progressively less belligerent over time. Now, this also has a connection, presumably, with rising standards of living. But if we compare both the amount of money and the amount of losses, material losses, and losses in terms of men in war, that a democracy is prepared to tolerate, certainly in Britain and America, that's gone down. Perhaps in line with certainly in Britain, it's been in line with the democratization of country. So I wonder whether that might be a problem that you've thought about.
Yeah, thanks. So the life cycles thing is very interesting, but I mean, it's kind of tough empirically, because you'd have to kind of develop a theory of the life cycles of democracies and autocracies and see to what extent they held up in the empirical literature, and maybe have your nose more. I do know, I guess probably what you're thinking. You're thinking of sort of Plato and Aristotle's versions of these theories, and some people have looked back at those cyclical theories and thought, oh, actually, Plato and Aristotle were onto something here, because people are getting increasingly worried about the health and future of democracies. But I mean, I know there's a certain amount of empirical literature by people like Adam Jaworski, who is a Polish-American political scientist, and he and others find that modern representative democracies are actually incredibly stable. And the reason that a lot of the number of democracies has increased in 3 main waves over the past century and a half or so has a lot to do with the way that once you become a democracy, and particularly a rich democracy, it's very unlikely that you'll slip away from that. But so 5th and 4th century Athens, it's interesting because I'm not sure that they had less military fervor in the 4th century than the 5th. It's just, I'm not saying that I'm sure that they had exactly the same amount of military fervor. I'm just saying it's kind of a complicated thing. And, like after they lose the Battle of Chaeronea, they put up this law of Eucrates saying, no one's allowed to establish tyranny. They seem quite pro-democratic. They give Demosthenes a crown. This is insane, right? Demosthenes is the person who's always been against the Macedonians. If they wanted to cozy up to the Macedonians and play it safe, they wouldn't have done that. And, even the Lamian War, or the Hellenic War, perhaps we should call it, when they rise up, the Greeks rise up after Alexander the Great dies. It's actually a very close-run thing. The Greeks have a ton of ships, and most of them are Athenians. And the Athenian state is in very good nick at that point. It's just that compared to the skill and resources of Philip, and then after Alexander, takes over the Persian Empire, just the sheer amount of resources and silver that then, of course, the successors get hold of. It's not. It shouldn't really be a contest, but Athens still does fairly well. But I think some of the hesitancy in the age of Demosthenes, interestingly, might have something to do with something that Reiter and Stamm talk about. Now, Reiter and Stamm and other Lacan people who studied democracy and war in the modern period one of the things they think is that democracies are better at war, or more successful militarily, partly because they're much better at being clever at choosing who they fight. So there's this whole other literature on democratic peace theory, which says that countries which are democracies almost never fight each other. In the ancient world, it's a bit different, but in the modern world, that seems to hold. But it also seems to be the case that democracies rarely pick fights, even with autocracies, unless they feel that A, they have to, and B, they can win. It's almost like they're putting into practice Thomas just war theory or something. But for whatever reason, that seems to help their numbers a really good amount. So that's probably, I think that's part of the reason that democracies seem to become more pacifistic over time.
Thank you. And Mateusz, you have a question.
Yes, thank you, James, for the excellent lecture and for showing this important perspective on tyranny and democracy. I want to follow up on what Xavier said earlier, namely that I think it's good to be precise what we mean by allowing everyone to speak, because you can allow everyone to speak, but somehow manage to suppress isagoria, because the context is important, it seems. So your example with the tyrant listening, I think it's a good context, because it's not only about people being able to speak, but other people being able to listen to what they speak. So there should be a certain seriousness of this. So I think the context of the assembly gives this seriousness, because everyone speaking at the assembly wants to say something about the matters of the state and the community. So one hypothesis would be that, or like in a Socratic dialogue, where Socrates asks specifically people to tell them whatever they think, actually, but the context is the pursuit of truth. So it gives a certain seriousness. It's just not just talking whatever comes to your mind. But in this context, if the first question would be if you agree with this, that there should be a certain institutionalized maybe context in which people could freely express their thoughts about the state and the social life and so on. But further on, what about comedy? Because you mentioned parousia and comedy. So I'm interested to hearing your thoughts about this, because and it's also an important topic nowadays. So comedy has been and still is an important channel of making certain ideas and critical ideas heard. But the context is entirely different, because the context is that it's not a serious or not entirely a serious thing, and it has to be funny. So so I'm willing to hear your thoughts on this aspect as well. I mean, comedy and parousia in comparison with a more serious type of free speech.
Yeah, thanks. Those are really, really good points. So the thing about institutionalization, I mean, I think one of the things I was trying to do in the lecture with incredible, foolish and sort of in a foolishly cavalier way, and obviously I can't really do it in such a brief lecture, was to criticize the deliberative democracy movement, which actually, I mean, I should say, I admire it hugely. Deliberative democracy has been, the leading theoretical kind of democracy in the post-war period. A lot of incredibly clever people, very good liberal Democrats in that movement. My suspicions about it are just that basically what it seems to do is to elevate the idea of rational deliberation to the purpose of democracy. Maybe that's a little bit unfair, but I think that tendency exists. So they're basically saying the reason that we have democracies is to sort of embody this type of rational evidence-based discussion. Now, I sort of have no problem with that in theory. My suspicions just start to twig when it starts to seem like the definition of rationality becomes a bit too heavy. And then when you build in all these conditions for speech, you can find yourself on the slippery slope where you start to exclude various types of information that comes in on the grounds that it's irrational or unscientific or whatever. So I do agree with you, of course, that if you have an actual assembly or council or even just a normal sort of meeting at work, it can't be the case that anybody just says whatever the hell they want. Although it's also true that people don't generally, when they're adults, want to shout out obscenities and stuff. But I take your point that there has to be some kind of order. I guess what I'm saying is just that there's a bit of a risk to fetishizing the rational discussion too much. And the risk is just that you actually end up setting the boundary, setting the limits too narrowly, and you end up excluding various sorts of information. And that's why I think voting, in a sense, is so people like Joshua Cohen, I think to say that they're down on voting would be ridiculous. But he talks a lot about aggregative democracy. I think he sees this as a slightly sort of uncouth way of doing it compared to deliberation. Because with aggregation, with voting, all you get is this very sort of blunt message of like, I like this more than that. And there's also all these mathematical problems with aggregating preferences that I won't go into. But I think that from a Democrat's point of view, there's actually more to say for aggregation, which is that it's very neutral. Because whatever your preference is, you just express it through this vote. And you don't have to justify it. And justification may seem like an admirable thing, but I'm not sure how much it is intrinsically a democratic value or an egalitarian value. So that's kind of my critique for what it's worth. I'm not sure it's going to have any effect. But I know other people have made similar criticisms. But so the Parasian comedy thing is kind of related because I've written separately about Aristophanes and Parasia and the way in which this sort of embodies a challenge to the deliberative ideal. Because it seems to say, here's a whole bunch of kind of wild and crazy speech that cannot be justified by contributing to the body politic. It's not a rational discussion that Aristophanes is engaged in. South Park and Family Guy and The Simpsons they're not engaged in rational discussion. They're not making policy proposals. And yet, I think that there does seem to be this habit in democracies to allow that kind of speech. And I think that what comedy can often do is just to push the limits a little further and to just increase the ability of others to speak and to sort of explore ideas in a way that it's much more difficult to do in formal settings. And I sort of accept, as I say, that in a parliament or a Congress, you have to have some formal rules. And that's why it's even more important, arguably, to have these kind of wild offsprings in a democratic society. And the Athenians, I mean, it's very interesting because the Athenians didn't just say, "Oh, you can have stand-up comedy in the tavernas." They institutionalized it. I mean, the Festival of Dionysus was a political and a state occasion, and it was a religious occasion. And at this festival, a public festival in the center of Athens, they had all this humor about, well, various things you can read about in Aristophanes. I'm not going to repeat, but you know the kind of humor I'm referring to.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Any further comments that anyone would like to make?
I'll make one if that's okay. It seemed to me, I really enjoyed the speech, but it seemed to me that there was an assumption that democracy is the best form of government. And if we go to Herodotus, there is that passage with the Persians, and they discuss the three respective forms of government: monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. And democracy is written out. And then you also mentioned Socrates in relation to Isagoria, where the most qualified person should speak. And then as a final point, if we want to tie it to the modern world, surely the direct democracy that's practiced in Greece is unviable here with our population size. So my question is, based on all of that, can you still convince me that democracy is a form of government that we should be striving towards?
It's a really good question because you've been very Isagoric, and I mean, that's one of my main assumptions, of course. Hopefully it's not a completely unquestioned assumption, but I mean, I don't know if I'll be able to sort of do a master argument for democracy here, but I mean, it's associated with various goods of prosperity and freedom, and it also seems to reflect something I didn't get time to go into here. It also seems to reflect a conception of ourselves as free and equal citizens, which I find attractive in itself. So it both seems to be associated with positive outcomes and to flow from values, which I think are good in themselves. And then once you get to the level of values, then it's sort of axiomatic. You really are at the level of assumptions where it just is, whether you like this or not. So I don't know how deep I can go, but I'll say this. I mean, I can't do that whole theory here, but there is an element of democracy which I like, which I wanted to go into here and explore and argue for, which is that it seems to me, and I know this is in itself a bold claim, it seems to me that democracies and open societies are better as systems of knowledge. That sounds, I know, a lot, but I'm not the first to have had this thought. I mean, in some ways, it's a Karl Popper kind of thought. You know, Popper saw falsification, bringing in hypotheses and rejecting hypotheses as central to science. And he also saw the ability of voters to reject certain governments that didn't pass the test as central to democracy. But there's also a whole school of thought that even overlaps with deliberative Democrats who have a conception of epistemic democracy. Epistemic from episteme, the Greek word for knowledge. And Josh Ober writes about this in his book, Democracy and Knowledge, too. And the idea is that actually by having freedom of information and having people come together in various institutions, you're actually getting society as a whole and the state the right kind of information to make clear-headed decisions. And for the reasons I've suggested here, it seems like autocracies are worse at that. That's my claim at any rate.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, thank you for that justification. Yeah.
I also wonder whether we shouldn't add. Obviously you've emphasized very much the utility of democracy, but I also wonder whether we shouldn't be democracy is something, or isagoria, freedom of speech, is something that makes life bearable. That actually not having it it may not. I think you are right. It may or not. It probably is useful. It's better for good governance. But on the other hand, living without it is just simply awful. And this is something that the Greeks very much recognized. With Achilles saying, "I hate like the gates of death." The man who thinks one thing and speaks another, and you know, the Greeks didn't want to be, you know, a great tragic hero does not want to be hiding his feelings and his thoughts. But anyway, that's just a fleeting comment. We've got time for one more question. So I noticed that Malcolm Lowe, you've got your hand up. So Malcolm, if you'd like to ask it.
Yes, I would like to suggest that when we are talking about democracies today, we are using a misleading terminology compared with the classical one, because modern democracies are in fact based much more on the structure of the Roman Republic than the structure of the Athenian democracy. And it's very interesting, in the Federalist Papers, amongst the founders of the United States Constitution, they were quite convinced they didn't want Athenian democracy. They said quite clearly, and they were much more impressed by the Roman model. What they found wrong with the Roman model is that the three branches of government were not clearly distinguished, that the same official could in fact be functioning in partly legislature, partly in executive, or partly judiciary. So they introduced the idea of clearly distinguishing between the three parts of government, but otherwise they were in favor of taking over the Roman constitution. And one has to say, I think one has to say that the only modern state which approximates in some measure to the Athenian democracy is Switzerland, with its frequent referenda at every level of government. So I think we are today talking in classical terms of oligarchies. I mean, in the United States, for instance, you have to be a very rich man to become elected a senator, let alone president. And in party governments mean, the political parties mean that only a small oligarchy, the leadership of one party or another, are really competing. So you have a system of competitive oligarchy. So I think we're very careful using using the terminology of democracy today and in ancient terms as if you're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I strongly agree with basically everything you said there. I mean, I'll take the point, you know, that when we're talking about the literature on democracy in the modern world, we're talking about a different kettle of fish. We're talking about representative democracies. I mean, here again, I think I go back to my point about it's sort of a scale. And while modern representative democracies aren't as radical as ancient Greek democracies in some ways, although in other ways, of course, they're more radical because they give votes to women and things like that, it's still useful to look at what happens to states that are this far along the scale. And the thing is, there's so much modern literature by political scientists who defined modern democracy in a certain way and use that word democracy that I'd really be going against the grain if I started talking about, representative oligarchies. Although in my heart, I sort of agree with you that they're actually, if not completely oligarchic, a constitution like the United States' constitution, that's clearly a mixed constitution. Is exactly as you say, it's a plebeian system. It's based on Rome and with some influence from Sparta, and it's very explicit what the founders are doing. It's not that they want to reject democracy completely; they just want to keep it within certain bounds. So that's a good point. I mean, I'll just go back to briefly, I guess, to what Seymour was saying with direct democracy. I think he brought that question up, and I suppose one more radical claim I would like to push is just the idea that direct democracy, moving towards more direct democracy, might be good in several ways, partly because I think it more fully reflects the foundational values of democracy. But it might also be good in terms of this particular lecture, because if democracy is an epistemic system, if it can be seen as a way of gathering information, basically the more input you have from the masses, the more accurate the society's sense of itself should be, at least in theory. Now, this is where it gets interesting, or one of the points at which it gets interesting, because I know Jonathan Rauch has just published a book, The Constitution of Knowledge, and he takes a very Republican view of knowledge, and he says that for the government or the Constitution to function effectively as a way of aggregating information and getting at the truth, you actually have to have lots of veto points and checks and balances to make sure that you don't just get these cascades of ignorance and people going along with others just because they saw other people doing X rather than because they had evidence for X. So I'm a little bit more optimistic about the ability of numbers of humans to produce accurate knowledge, but I agree that it needs to be thought about. The institutions need to be thought about very carefully.
I'm sorry, I just thought I'd make one point about the referenda. Have you heard of the intellectual Etienne Chouard in France? And during the Gilets jaunes, they were complaining about the corrupt government and saying they don't have genuine democracy. And he wanted them to be able to have referenda to propose a law to revoke a minister and a couple of other powers. And it would be like a free-for-all democracy. And obviously there's arguments that you need checks and balances and restrictions, but is that not maybe just a secret argument that oligarchs make in order not to entrust the people with full power?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is kind of, I've always sort of thought that, to be honest. I mean, I think the whole mixed constitution idea is already sort of like, why do we have to mix in monarchy? That seems to assume that it's a good thing. But yeah, I mean, that would be a kind of uncharitable way of putting the point. But I have often suspected that myself. I mean, a more charitable way of putting it might be that it is a phenomenon that, Thucydides and others identified, and that modern social scientists have also talked about and documented, that you have these sort of cascades, irrational cascades of people just following along what other people have done, or following figures of authority and not actually gathering information themselves. And that's, I think, when the system of democracy is a rational system begins to break down, because in those cases you're not actually signaling the empirical knowledge that you have personally into the system, right? It's similar to preference falsification. It doesn't matter whether you're not saying what your true belief is because of a tyrant or because of the masses. If you're not saying, I actually really prefer X rather than Y, then society is being deprived of that one data point. So that might be a problem, I will admit, for direct democracy as it is for tyranny. But I think there are possibilities, there are ways of doing this which could iron out those problems. But
yeah, I hear you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, James. I'm conscious that it's getting late in your part of the world, and over here, I'm sure lots of us are wanting to get some breakfast. Thank you so much. I think that was a really stimulating paper, because there were so many things to pick up, and it's really interesting. So many ideas, so many different directions coming in, and I think we really have shown Isagoria in action in this democratic forum rather than tyrannical forum, I hope, in any case. So thank you. Mateusz, our next speaker is indeed, or he was in the room until just a moment ago, which was Javier Marquez. Mateusz, do you want to say anything?
No, just yeah, that was a very, very good lecture and discussion, and we will have Javier's lecture on the 11th of January, the same time. So thank you, and yeah, and the lecture will be available on the YouTube channel. I will send out the information later. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks everyone for all your comments.
Great. See you soon. Bye.